I'm 38 years old, and the day I realized my entire life was built on a lie started with my mother whispering to my Aunt Claire in the kitchen like I couldn't hear them from the living room. "She's just having another episode," my mother said, her voice soft and concerned, the kind of concern that made my skin crawl. "We're all very worried about her." I wasn't having an episode. I was sitting on the couch remembering something my father had said during dinner the night before, something that didn't match with what my mother had claimed happened last summer. I'd simply asked about it. A reasonable question, a sane question, but my mother had gone silent, exchanged a look with my father, and then that look had turned into hushed phone calls, and now I was having an episode again. That was the thing about my family. They had perfected the art of making the truth sound like mental illness. My name is Leighton, by the way. I need to be clear about that from the start because my parents spent a lot of years trying to make sure nobody would believe what came out of my mouth. And if you're reading this, if you're reading my story, you need to understand what it's like to watch everyone you love slowly transform you into a villain in your own life. The fear started small. It started the way most abuse does, invisible at first, then so normalized you forget there was ever a time you weren't afraid. I was probably 7 when I first noticed it. I came home from school with my shirt torn, and I told my mother that Derek Williams had pushed me off the monkey bars. It was a playground accident. Kids were rough sometimes, but instead of brushing off my jacket and maybe mentioning something to the teacher, my mother had pulled me into the bathroom and looked at me like I'd just confessed to something unspeakable. "That's not what happened," she said quietly, not asking, telling. "But Mom, he did, he pushed." "You're remembering it wrong, Leighton. You pushed him. You were being aggressive as usual and he defended himself." I was 7. I didn't have the cognitive tools to argue with her reality, I just accepted it. I had pushed Derek Williams, I was aggressive, the torn shirt was my fault. And somewhere deep in my little girl brain a tiny alarm began to sound. A small voice asking, "Are you sure what you remember? Are you sure you can trust yourself?" They say gaslighting is when someone makes you question reality, but that definition doesn't capture what it actually feels like to be inside it. It's not like watching a magic trick and being confused about how the illusion works. It's like slowly being convinced that the ground beneath your feet isn't solid, that you might fall through at any moment, and by the time you realize you've been deceived, you're so afraid of falling that you cling to the person who told you the ground was never real in the first place. My parents were good at it, so good that by the time I was in high school, I had learned to doubt myself before anyone else could do it for me. There was the incident in 9th grade when I came home from a friend's house and asked my mother why she told their mother that I was going through a difficult phase and might lash out. I had no idea what she was talking about. I didn't remember doing anything to warrant that kind of warning, but my mother's expression shifted into that concerned face again, the one that made my stomach tighten. "I was protecting you," she said. "Your behavior lately has been concerning to me as your mother, and I think it's only responsible to let people know they should be careful around you. You wouldn't understand, but it's about duty." I was 14, I wasn't lashing out. I was sad sometimes, sure, what teenager isn't? But my mother had transformed my normal adolescent emotions into a behavioral warning. She told my best friend's mother that I was unstable. And it worked. Suddenly invitations stopped coming. Jessica's mom always had vague excuses when I asked if I could come over. She was worried about me, Jessica said awkwardly. Her mom thought it might be better if we spent some time apart. Jessica liked me, but her mom was concerned about negative influences, and apparently I was one. I wasn't a negative influence. I was a girl who got sad, but I didn't have the language to defend myself. I didn't have the framework to understand that what my mother had done was deliberately isolate me by poisoning every relationship I had. I just thought that if everyone seemed concerned about me, maybe I should be concerned too. This became the pattern of my life. I would observe something, remember something, question something, and my parents would rewrite it. Sometimes they did this overtly, sitting me down with serious faces to explain where I was wrong, but more often it was subtler. A soft comment, a disappointed sigh, a conversation they had with another adult just loud enough for me to overhear, where they spoke about me like I was a burden, a problem, a girl who couldn't be trusted. By the time I was 16, I had essentially isolated myself on their behalf. I didn't invite people over because I was ashamed of how my parents talked about me. I didn't mention my interests because I was terrified of them being used as evidence of my instability. I became smaller, quieter, more compliant, the perfect target for psychological abuse. But the cruelest part wasn't the obvious manipulation. The cruelest part was that my parents genuinely seemed to believe their own narrative. They would do these things, tell people I was unstable, rewrite my memories, control my social interactions, and they would do it with genuine concern on their faces, like they were protecting me, like they were helping. And I believed them. For decades I believed them. There was my college boyfriend, Marcus, who broke up with me after about 8 months. He'd seemed nice enough at first, but eventually he started to pull away. When I asked him why, he wouldn't give me a straight answer, just vague mentions of how intense I was, how difficult it was to be in a relationship with me. I was confused and hurt, and I called my mother crying. Instead of comforting me, she said, "Well, Leighton, you do have a tendency to be overwhelming. People find you exhausting, you always have." Not asked, stated as fact. Looking back, I think Marcus probably just wasn't that into me. People drift apart sometimes, but my mother had recontextualized it as yet another proof of my fundamental wrongness, and I had internalized it. I spent years believing that I was exhausting, overwhelming, a burden to anyone who came close to me. The manipulation escalated in subtler ways as I got older. There were the strategic conversations they'd have with relatives during family gatherings. I'd walk in mid-sentence to hear my mother saying something like, "We're really concerned about her mental stability. We're thinking about suggesting she see someone," even though there was nothing wrong with me. She never made these comments directly to me, but she made sure I overheard them. She wanted me to know that everyone was watching me, analyzing me, waiting for me to prove that I was crazy. And here's the insidious part. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you're told constantly that you're unstable, you start to see evidence of it everywhere. Your nervousness becomes anxiety. Your sadness becomes depression. Your anger becomes an episode. Your memories become false recollections. You internalize the diagnosis that was never made by anyone qualified to make it, and you start to perform the illness they've convinced you that you have. I developed actual anxiety. I did struggle with depression, but it wasn't because I was fundamentally broken. It was because I was living under constant psychological siege, and every time I became anxious or sad, which is a normal human response to abuse, my parents pointed at it and said, "See, we were right, she's unstable." By my mid-20s, I had seen 3 different therapists, and here's something that nobody tells you about therapists. They can only work with the information they're given. My parents had spent decades convincing me that my recollections were unreliable, so when I sat in a therapist's office, I would describe a memory of something my parents had done, and I would immediately add a disclaimer like, "At least I think that's what happened. My memory is probably wrong." I had been so thoroughly conditioned to doubt myself that I couldn't even advocate for my own reality. One therapist, Dr. Patterson, actually challenged this. In my second session with her, she asked me to describe something my mother had done that bothered me. I told her about an incident from a few months before, where my mother had told me that I was making things up about my childhood. "Do you believe her?" Dr. Patterson asked. I don't know, probably. She usually remembers things better than I do. But is it possible she might have a reason to rewrite your memories? Could that benefit her? I remember staring at her like she'd suggested something radical, because I think on some level I was beginning to realize that she had. My mother's version of my memories was always the version that made her look better. My father's version of his behavior was always the version that made him sound reasonable. But I couldn't quite let myself acknowledge that, because if they were lying, then that meant they were deliberately hurting me. And I wasn't ready to live in a world where my parents were capable of that. I stopped seeing Dr. Patterson. I told myself it was because she wasn't helping, but really it was because she was asking me to question my parents, and I wasn't ready to do that. I was too afraid of the person I would become if I allowed myself to believe that they had hurt me. Instead, I doubled down on doubting myself. I got quieter. I stopped telling people about my experiences. I stopped calling friends. I became almost invisible, moving through life like a ghost, watching everything but never quite participating, never quite letting anyone all the way in. Because if I did, they might find out that I was unstable. They might discover what my parents had been trying to protect them from. The loneliness was suffocating. I remember being 29 years old and realizing that I couldn't name a single person who knew me, not the real me. I had spent 2 decades carefully hiding myself, carefully monitoring everything I said, constantly second-guessing my own reality. I had friends, sure, but they knew a version of me that was small and careful. They didn't know my actual thoughts or feelings. I had trained myself not to have them, or at least not to express them. My parents had essentially isolated me without ever actually confining me. They'd done it by making me believe that I was dangerous, that the world needed to be protected from me, that my own mind couldn't be trusted. And I had done the rest of the work myself. The really cruel thing about psychological manipulation is that the abuser never has to do anything physically violent or obviously wrong. They just have to make you question yourself, make you believe that your perspective is skewed, make you think that other people's versions of reality are more legitimate than yours, and you will do the rest of the abuse for them. You will isolate yourself, you will deny yourself, you will hurt yourself. And then when you're suffering, they can point at you and say, "See, we were right to worry." Things might have continued like that indefinitely if it hadn't been for Mrs. Elena Chen. Elena Chen had been our next-door neighbor for almost 40 years. She was in her 80s by the time I finally realized she'd been watching my family this entire time, watching, observing, collecting memories, waiting, I think, for the right moment to tell me what she'd seen. I didn't notice her at first. How could I? My parents had trained me not to notice anyone who might have a different perspective on them, but Elena was patient. She was the kind of person who said hello when she saw you, who asked how you were in a way that seemed like she genuinely wanted to know the answer. She left fresh lemon bars on our porch during the holidays. She waved from her front window. It took me a long time to realize she was being kind, because kindness felt suspect to me. I was so used to everyone either confirming the story my parents had told about me or avoiding me entirely that I didn't know how to receive simple human decency. The first real conversation I had with Elena was maybe 6 months before everything changed. I was in the front yard doing yard work on a Saturday morning, and Elena came over with 2 cups of iced tea. "I thought you might be thirsty," she said, handing me one. She was small, tiny, really, with white hair and the kind of weathered face that comes from a lot of living. "Thank you," I said, awkward with the generosity of it. "That's kind of you." She studied me for a moment in a way that made me nervous. People studying me always made me nervous. "Your mother, does she ever let you just be happy? Just sit and enjoy something without her finding a problem with it?" The question was so direct, so unexpected that I didn't know how to answer it. What do you mean?" "I've lived next to your family for a long time," Elena said. "I've watched you grow up. You used to smile when you were very young. I haven't seen that smile in years." And just like that, I felt the familiar panic rising. She was observing me. She was noticing something. She was going to add her voice to the chorus of people concerned about my instability. "I'm fine," I said quickly. "Just busy, life gets hectic." But Elena didn't look convinced. She just smiled sadly and said, "Well, if you ever want to sit down and drink iced tea without anyone telling you you're doing it wrong, my porch is always open." She went back home, and I stood there with the cup of tea in my hands, shaking slightly, not sure why I was so afraid of her kindness. Over the next several months, Elena continued to be kind in these small, subtle ways. She never pushed, she never asked questions. She just existed on her porch in a way that made me feel seen, and eventually I started to sit with her, just for a few minutes at first, just to drink tea and watch the world go by. And slowly, so slowly that I didn't even notice it happening, I started to trust her. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't ask me leading questions to get me to confess family secrets. She didn't offer unsolicited advice. She just listened. She would ask me about my work or my interests, and when I answered, she would actually listen. She wouldn't nod while already thinking about how to respond. She wouldn't interrupt me to recontextualize my experiences. She would just listen. One afternoon, about 5 months before everything fell apart, Elena said something that lodged itself in my brain like a seed. "Your mother called me when you were in high school," Elena said. "We were sitting on her porch, watching the street. She said I should be careful around you, that you were going through a phase and she didn't want me to be a bad influence." I felt that familiar contraction in my chest, the shame, the confirmation that yes, apparently everyone had been warned about me. "She was right," I said quietly. "I was difficult." "No," Elena said firmly. "No, you weren't. I watched you. You were a regular teenager. You were quiet, yes, you kept to yourself, but you were thoughtful and kind, and the only difficulty I ever saw was between you and your mother. She was just worried." "She was controlling," Elena said bluntly. and I've been afraid to tell you that for years." I didn't respond. I couldn't, because if what Elena was saying was true, if my mother had deliberately tried to isolate me from a neighbor who could have seen her for what she was, then everything I believed about myself might be wrong, and I wasn't ready for that. But Elena had planted the seed, and I couldn't unplant it. Over the next few weeks, I found myself thinking about things differently. I thought about the incident with Derek Williams at the Monkey Bars. I'd been in my 40s before I'd understood that childhood memory clearly, and when I did, I realized I had no idea if I'd actually pushed him or if he'd pushed me. My mother's version had become my version, but I had no way of knowing what was real. I thought about Jessica and all the other friendships that had quietly dissolved in high school. How many of those had been because of something my mother said? How many times had I been poisoned in people's eyes before they even got to know me? I thought about Marcus and all the other relationships that had failed. Had I really been exhausting and overwhelming, or had I just been terrified? Had I been so convinced of my own wrongness that I'd self-sabotaged everything? I thought about therapy and the way I'd second-guessed myself with every therapist I saw. How many times had I apologized for my own reality? And I thought about my parents' faces when they looked at me with concern, that soft, worried expression that made me feel broken. Had that ever been real concern, or had it been performance? Had it been the careful cultivation of a narrative? I couldn't ask them. I didn't have the framework for that conversation. My entire life had been constructed around the principle that my perspective was wrong, and they were right. If I suddenly said, "I think you've been manipulating me my entire life," they would look at me with that concerned expression and suggest it was another episode. So instead, I did something I'd never done before. I started gathering evidence. It sounds clinical, I know. It sounds cold and strategic. But I needed to know if I was losing my mind, if I was finally becoming the person my parents had always said I was. So I started keeping a journal, not of my feelings or my emotions, I was too afraid of those, just facts, dates, conversations, things my parents said that contradicted what they'd said before, stories that didn't match up with what I remembered. I also started asking questions, very carefully, very gently, not confrontational, just curious. "Mom, do you remember when I came home with my shirt torn in 2nd grade? What happened with that?" "I don't remember any such thing," she said. "Derek Williams, he pushed me or I pushed him. One of those things happened." "I don't recall that, honey. Are you sure that happened? You know you had such a vivid imagination as a child. You used to make things up." But I was starting to understand now that her denials weren't about the actual events. They were about control. By denying the memories, she was forcing me to question myself. And by forcing me to question myself, she was maintaining her power over me. I was 38 years old, and I was finally seeing how this worked. I started asking my father questions too, but he was different. My father had always been the quieter one. He didn't engage in my mother's dramatic concern. He just seemed to agree with her. When I asked about my childhood, he'd say vague things like, "Your mother probably remembers better than I do," or "That was a long time ago, Leighton." Never quite answering, never quite confirming, just maintaining plausible deniability. And I started noticing other things, small things. My mother made a comment about my Aunt Susan that was contradicted by something my Aunt Susan had told me directly. My father mentioned an inheritance decision that sounded different from what my older brother had said happened. Someone had paid for something that my mother claimed had been paid for by someone else. The inconsistencies started to pile up. Not huge things, not obviously criminal things, but gaps in the narrative, places where the story didn't quite hold up. And each gap made me wonder, what else had they lied about? That's when Elena told me something that changed everything. We were on her porch one afternoon in early June. It was hot, and she had made lemonade, and I was starting to feel like I could almost be myself around her. Not entirely myself, I was still too conditioned for that, but more like myself than I was with anyone else. Elena set down her glass and looked at me with an expression that was both sad and determined. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "I've been thinking about whether to tell you for a long time, and I think the moment has come. I think you're ready." My stomach dropped. This was it. This was when she revealed that she'd believed my parents' narrative too. This was when she joined the chorus of people telling me I was unstable. "My mother was a teacher," Elena continued. "Did you know that? She taught at the elementary school for 40 years. When your parents moved in next door, I was young, but not so young that I didn't recognize what I was seeing. She paused and I held my breath. Your mother used to take you over to the school sometimes, and one day my mother came home and told your father something was wrong, that she'd watched your mother tell you that something had happened, and then watched your mother tell a completely different story to her, and that you were confused, that you kept trying to correct your mother, but your mother just kept insisting that her version was the real one. Elena's voice was steady, but her eyes were sad. My mother wanted to do something, she wanted to tell someone, but this was the 70s, you know, it wasn't like now. Nobody really talked about psychological abuse, and your mother was very respected in the community, so my mother didn't do anything, she just watched. I couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't breathe properly. And I've watched too, Elena continued. For 40 years, I've watched you become smaller and quieter. I've seen your mother's whisper campaigns. I've heard her on the phone telling people to keep their distance from you. And I've been a coward because I didn't know how to help. I didn't know if it was my place to say anything. And I didn't know if you would believe me. What? My voice was barely a whisper. What was the thing? What did my mother lie about? Elena took a long breath. I don't know the specific incident my mother witnessed, honey. She passed away when I was in my 20s. But I know what I've seen. I know that your mother has systematically made you doubt yourself. I know that she's told people you're unstable when you're not. And I know that whatever it is she's protecting, whatever truth she doesn't want you to remember or tell, it's big enough that she's been willing to sacrifice your mental health to keep it hidden. I felt like I was going to throw up. If you've known this the whole time, why didn't you say anything? Because I was afraid, Elena said quietly. I was afraid of your mother. I was afraid of making things worse. I was afraid that if I told you, you wouldn't believe me and it would just make things harder. I'm an old woman, Leighton. I'm 84 years old. I'm also a coward. But then she reached over and took my hand, and she said the thing that broke me open. You were never crazy. You were never unstable. You were never the problem. The problem was that your parents needed you to believe you were broken, and you were brave enough to survive that. I'm so sorry it took me 40 years to say it out loud. I cried. I sat on Elena's porch and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was a very young child. Not the careful, controlled crying that I'd learned to do so as not to seem too emotional or unstable, but real crying, the kind of crying that comes from your whole body. Elena held my hand and she didn't try to fix it. She didn't tell me to stop or calm down or pull myself together. She just sat with me in the fact of my breaking. When I finally stopped, I asked her, but what was it? What do you think they were hiding? Elena shook her head. I don't know for certain, but I know it was serious enough to require 40 years of psychological abuse to keep you quiet about it. I know it was big enough that they needed to make sure nobody would believe you if you tried to talk about it. That night I went home and I couldn't look at my parents. I sat at dinner and I picked at my food and my mother asked if I was feeling okay, and I couldn't respond without my voice shaking. Leighton, my mother's concerned face appeared. Are you having another episode? And something shifted inside me. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't accept her framing. I didn't apologize for my emotions. I didn't doubt myself. No, I said quietly. I'm not having an episode. I'm sad. I'm sad because my entire life has been a lie and I just realized it, and I'm coming to terms with that. My parents stared at me. Don't be ridiculous, my mother said. Her tone was sharp now, the concernedness dropping away for just a second. You're being dramatic. But I'd heard it. I'd heard the moment where her mask slipped, and I knew that I'd been right. I'd been right all along. Something was very wrong, and it wasn't me. No, I said. I'm being honest for the first time in 38 years. I left the table. I went to my room, and I finally started to look for the truth. The next day I called a lawyer. I don't know why I did it. I didn't have a specific plan, but I felt like if I didn't do something, if I didn't take some kind of action, I was going to disappear into my own doubt again. I was going to convince myself that Elena had been kind but wrong, that my parents really had been concerned about me, that I really was unstable. The lawyer I found was a woman named Patricia Morrison, who specialized in family law and had some experience with what she called complex family dynamics. I told her that I suspected my parents had been psychologically abusive and that I thought they were hiding something, but I didn't have any evidence. I didn't even know what I was looking for. Patricia was matter of fact. Do you have access to your family's documents, your medical records, old financial records? Some, I said. My mother keeps a lot of papers in the house, and I might be able to access some things. Start with those, Patricia said. Look for inconsistencies, look for anything that seems out of place, and start keeping a detailed journal of any conversations or incidents that seem manipulative. A paper trail is going to be important if you want to establish a pattern. So I did something that I feel a little guilty about even now, though not guilty enough to stop. I started going through my parents' office. I told myself I was just looking for my own documents, birth certificate, medical records, things like that, things I should have access to anyway. But really I was looking for proof that I wasn't crazy, proof that something was wrong. It took me 3 weeks. 3 weeks of carefully going through filing cabinets when my parents were out of the house, photographing documents with my phone, putting everything back exactly as I'd found it. My heart was pounding the entire time, convinced that I would be caught, that this would be the final proof of my instability. But nobody caught me, because my parents never imagined I would question them. They'd spent 3 decades making sure I didn't have the confidence to do this. What I found was not what I expected. I found hospital records from when I was 14 years old, records for psychiatric evaluation, notes from a doctor who'd suggested that there was no evidence of any mental illness, that I was a normal adolescent processing normal emotions, and that if anything, my family dynamic seemed to be the source of my stress. My mother's notes in the margins of those records said, "He's wrong, she's clearly ill, needs second opinion." There was no second opinion. There was just a note from a different doctor who my mother had apparently sought out, who seemed to have a lower standard for diagnosis, and had written in his report that yes, I showed signs of emotional instability and might benefit from medication. I had no memory of being medicated, but there were prescription slips in the files, prescriptions for anti-anxiety medication, written by the second doctor, dated for a time when I was 14, prescriptions that, according to my mother's notes, I had refused to take. But I didn't refuse them. I had no memory of them being offered, which meant either my mother had told the doctor I refused when I hadn't, or she had lied to me about what the medication was for. The controlled rage I felt in that moment was unlike anything I'd experienced before. There was more. There were records of school absences that I didn't remember, supposedly due to mental health days that my mother had arranged. There were notes from my high school counselor expressing concern about my social isolation and suggesting that my mother had discouraged me from attending school events. My mother had lied to the school. She told them I was isolated because of my behavior, when really she'd been the one isolating me. And there, buried in a file folder labeled Medical Past, I found something else. A document from a private psychiatric facility, dated to when I was 16 years old. A letter from my mother to the facility, inquiring about long-term inpatient treatment for her daughter, who she described as having severe emotional and behavioral issues, and being a danger to herself and others. I had never been to an inpatient facility. I had no memory of this letter ever being sent to me or discussed with me, but it was there, in my mother's handwriting, asking a psychiatric hospital to take her teenage daughter away. The letter had a note in my mother's handwriting in the margin, "Did not pursue, she seemed better after discussion." I had no memory of any discussion, but my mother had apparently considered institutionalizing me, deciding against it, and then never mentioning it to me. And now, more than 20 years later, the documentation of her plan was sitting in a filing cabinet in her office, probably something she'd forgotten about. I sat on the floor of my parents' office with these documents in my hands, and I understood something that I'd been moving toward for weeks. My mother didn't love me, or if she did, her love was the kind that required me to be broken. Her love was conditional on me being exactly the person she'd decided I should be, and if I deviated from that, she would find ways to make me conform. That's when I started making copies of everything. I went to a copy shop and scanned every relevant document. I made sure I had everything I needed to prove that this had been deliberate, that I wasn't misremembering, that I wasn't being dramatic. And I still didn't know what the original secret was. These documents proved that my parents had been abusive and that they'd been willing to institutionalize me to keep me quiet. But quiet about what? I went back to Elena. "There's something else," I said. "Something bigger." My mother tried to have me institutionalized. She wrote to a psychiatric facility and said I was dangerous. Elena's face was grave. I thought there might be something like that, she said. When you were younger, maybe 12 or 13, I heard your parents having a very serious conversation. Your father said something like, if she remembers, everything falls apart. Your mother said that she had it under control, that you'd never remember, but they needed to be more careful. Remembers what? I was almost pleading. What am I supposed to remember? I don't know, Elena said. But honey, whatever it is, it's something they did, not something you did, because they were talking about your memory of it, not about your behavior. Your memory of it, something they did, something important enough to require decades of psychological abuse to suppress. I thought about my childhood. I thought about memories that seemed fuzzy, that I'd always dismissed as products of my vivid imagination. I thought about the way my mother would shut down any conversation about my early childhood, saying that I was too young to remember accurately. I thought about a specific memory that I'd had since I was very small, a memory of my father, a memory of something I wasn't supposed to see, a memory that my mother had told me was a dream. And I realized I thought I'd been remembering something, a door opening, a sound that shouldn't have happened, a moment of intense fear, but I'd been conditioned not to trust that memory. I'd been told it was imagination, confusion, a nightmare from childhood. I'd pushed it down so deeply that I'd almost convinced myself it had never happened. But Elena had said, when you were younger, she said that you'd never remember. What if I had remembered? What if at some point I'd tried to tell someone? What if my mother had responded by convincing me I was crazy? That night I did something I hadn't done in decades. I tried to consciously remember that memory, the one I'd pushed down, the one my mother had recontextualized as a dream. And it came back, slowly, in fragments, in sensory flashes that made me shake. I was maybe 5 years old. I was sick. I remember being hot with fever. My mother had given me medicine and told me to sleep, but the medicine had made me feel strange, disconnected, hallucinating maybe, I realized now. My mother might have given me something stronger than baby aspirin. And I remember getting out of bed. The house was dark. I remember going to my parents' bedroom. I remember my father wasn't in bed with my mother. I remember going downstairs. I remember a door, my father's study, being open when it was usually closed. And I remember seeing something that frightened me, something that made me feel sick and confused and scared. I remember my father yelling. I remember my mother grabbing me and rushing me back to bed. I remember her voice, sharp in a way I rarely heard it. You were dreaming. You were having a nightmare from the fever. Don't ever talk about this. Do you understand? You were dreaming. I'd been 5 years old. I'd been feverish and medicated and confused, and my mother had shaped that confusion into certainty. I had been dreaming. Except I wasn't sure anymore that I had been. For decades, I'd trusted my mother's version of that night, but now I knew what my mother was capable of. I knew that she could systematically destroy her daughter's reality. I knew that she would medicate me without my understanding and convince me I was hallucinating. I knew that she would hide documentary evidence of her abuse in files I wasn't supposed to access. What had I actually seen that night? I called Patricia, my lawyer, and I told her what I'd found and what I suspected. The question isn't what you remember, Patricia said. The question is whether there's evidence of what you're alleging. And right now you have evidence of psychological abuse, medical manipulation, and attempted institutionalization. Those are serious things. That's enough to pursue legal action if you want to. But I don't even know what the original crime was, I said. Yet, Patricia said, but sometimes you have to start pulling a thread and the whole tapestry unravels. That's when I decided to confront my parents. Not to accuse them, not to demand they confess to whatever they were hiding, but to see how they'd react, to see if their reaction would give me any information about what I was looking for. I invited both of my parents to sit down with me in the living room on a Thursday evening. My mother immediately looked concerned, which was ironic given that I was about to ask them why they'd spent my entire life making me concerned about myself. I've been thinking about my childhood, I said carefully, and I've realized that my memory of some things isn't very clear. I wanted to talk to you about some of the things I remember, just to clarify. My father nodded. He always deferred to my mother, so he didn't say anything. My mother's smile became tighter. I remember being evaluated by a psychiatrist when I was 14, I continued. And I remember that the evaluation was supposedly because I was having behavioral problems, but I don't actually remember having any behavioral problems. Can you tell me why I was sent to a psychiatrist? My mother and father exchanged a glance. We were concerned about you, my mother said carefully. You were showing signs of emotional distress, and we thought it would be helpful to have a professional evaluate you. But I don't remember being emotionally distressed, I said. I remember being a normal teenager. I remember being quiet. I remember being isolated. But I remember my friends being discouraged from calling me. I remember being told that the isolation was because of something wrong with me when really... Stop, my mother's voice was sharp. Stop right there, you're misremembering again. This is exactly what I was worried about. You distort reality and then become upset when we try to correct you. And there it was, that absolute refusal to acknowledge my experience, that certainty that her version was the only version that mattered. I'm not misremembering, I said, and my voice was steady in a way that surprised me. I'm remembering, and I've found documentation that proves what I'm remembering is accurate. I found the letter you wrote to the psychiatric facility when I was 16, the letter where you asked them if they could institutionalize me. My mother's face drained of color. For just a second, just a moment, her mask slipped. I saw fear there. I saw something that looked like panic. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, but her voice wasn't concerned anymore. It was flat, dangerous. Yes, you do, I said. I found it in your office, in a file folder labeled Medical Past. You were planning to send me away. My father stood up abruptly. This conversation is over. You're upset and you're not thinking clearly. We have your best interests at heart, and we're not going to sit here and be accused of things we didn't do. But they had done it. We all knew they had done it. I'm not upset, I said, surprising myself with the calm in my voice. I'm finally thinking clearly. For the first time in my life, I'm seeing you as you actually are, instead of as the concerned parents you've pretended to be. And I'm leaving. I'm moving out, and I'm not coming back until you're willing to be honest about what you've done. I did leave. I walked upstairs, packed a bag, and I got in my car and drove to a hotel. It sounds dramatic, but it didn't feel dramatic. It felt like the most sane thing I'd done in decades. My mother called me 6 times that night. I didn't answer. My father sent an email saying that they were very concerned about my mental state and that they were considering professional help. Which was, of course, his version of threatening me. His version of saying, we are still in control. We are still the ones who get to decide if you're crazy. But I was done believing them. The next day I called my older brother, David. He and I had never been close. My mother had spent years positioning us as rivals, suggesting that David couldn't be trusted, that he was jealous of me. But he was family, and I needed to know if he'd experienced any of this. When I told him what I'd found, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. David, I said. I knew something was wrong, he said finally. I don't know what, I don't remember very clearly, but I remember Mom telling me to look after you, to keep an eye on you in case you had one of your episodes. And I remember you not being allowed to do things that I could do. I remember Dad being weird sometimes and Mom always explaining it away. But I didn't know how to talk about it. I just accepted it. There's something else, I said. Something they've been hiding since I was small. Something that made them think they needed to keep me quiet for decades. What is it? David asked. I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. David was quiet for a long moment. Be careful, he said finally. I think they're actually capable of hurting you to keep you quiet. I don't know why I think that, but I do. He was right. My parents were capable of anything. I was starting to understand that the person I'd known my whole life, the concerned, loving parents, had never actually existed. The people I'd been living with were people who would psychologically abuse their child for decades to maintain a narrative, people who would consider institutionalizing their daughter, people who would lie to doctors and teachers and neighbors to isolate their target. These were not good people. So I kept digging. With Patricia's help, I filed a request for all of my medical records. I contacted the psychiatric facility that my mother had written to when I was 16. I started calling childhood friends and trying to understand what had really happened in high school, what my mother had actually told their parents. And slowly a picture emerged. My mother had been methodical. She'd been strategic. She'd spent years building a narrative that painted me as unstable, unreliable, and unsafe to be around. She'd done this not just through conversation but through action. She'd discouraged friendships. She'd brought me to doctors and suggested diagnoses that those doctors shouldn't have entertained. She'd written letters expressing concern about my mental state. She'd tried to have me institutionalized. And the whole time, she'd acted like she was helping, like she was protecting me from my own broken mind. My father had simply enabled it. He'd never actively participated in the abuse, but he'd also never stopped it. He'd stood by and let his wife destroy his daughter's reality, and he'd convinced himself that he was being a good father by not interfering. The two of them together had created an absolute reality in which I was the problem, and they'd made sure that everyone who might have questioned that narrative was either isolated from me or convinced of my instability before they could develop their own understanding of me. What they'd never accounted for was Elena. They'd never accounted for the fact that there was a witness who'd been watching them for 40 years and who, at the end of her life, was finally brave enough to speak. The investigation, and that's what it had become, a full investigation into my past, took 3 months. During that time, I moved into an apartment. I started seeing a real therapist, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to Elena, though I appreciated the symmetry. I started rebuilding relationships with friends and family members. I started, very slowly, relearning how to trust myself. Dr. Chen helped me understand something important. The abuse I'd suffered wasn't the kind that left obvious marks. It was the kind that made you believe you were the abuser. It was the kind that made you spend decades apologizing for being alive. It was the kind that was almost impossible to prove to anyone who hadn't been watching closely. But the documents helped. The prescription slips. The psychiatric evaluation that I'd refused to take medication for, even though I had no memory of refusing. The letter about institutionalization. The notes in my mother's handwriting expressing frustration with doctors who wouldn't diagnose me with illnesses I didn't have. And the testimony of Elena, who'd been watching for 40 years. By late September, I had enough evidence to bring a civil suit against my parents. Not for anything specific, but for emotional abuse, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and medical fraud. Patricia advised me that I probably wouldn't win, that the legal system didn't handle psychological abuse well, that my parents' lawyers would argue that they were just concerned parents, that I was misinterpreting their actions, that I'd always been an unreliable narrator. But, Patricia said, the process itself might be valuable. It will force them to respond to documented evidence. It will put their behavior into a legal context, and it will make other people aware of what they did. So I sued my parents. The lawsuit started in October, and it was immediate and brutal. My mother's lawyer tried to paint me as a person with a history of mental illness who was now experiencing a psychotic episode in which I was blaming my parents for that illness. He presented the psychiatric records, emphasizing only the parts that suggested I might have been unstable. He said I was a confused woman with boundary issues who was trying to blame her loving parents for her own failures in life. My father's lawyer said that he had simply trusted his wife's judgment about my well-being, that he had never intended any harm, that he was a good man who'd been caught up in a family situation he didn't fully understand. It was gaslighting on a legal scale. But here's what happened. Documentation is powerful. The courts might not care about my emotions or my memories, but they care about the actual evidence. They cared that my mother had written letters expressing concern about me to psychiatric facilities. They cared that I'd been prescribed medication for a condition I had no memory of. They cared that my mother had told the school I was isolated while simultaneously discouraging me from attending school events. The narrative that my mother had carefully constructed started to crack. And then something else happened that I hadn't anticipated. My cousin Sarah, who I'd reached out to during my investigation, came forward with her own story. She said that she remembered my mother telling her parents that I was unstable when I was in high school, and that this had influenced their behavior toward me. She said that she'd felt guilty about it for years, but hadn't known how to address it. Then my childhood friend Jessica, the one whose mother had been told not to let me in their house, called me. She said she'd been thinking about our friendship, about how it had ended, and she realized that she'd never actually experienced any of the problems her mother had described. She said her mother had simply taken my mother's word for it. And then the most devastating witness showed up, my former high school counselor, Mr. Hernandez. He came forward and said that he had documentation of several instances in which my mother had called the school and demanded that I be kept out of certain activities. He said that he'd always found it unusual, but he deferred to the parents' judgment. Now, looking back, he felt terrible about it. The narrative was collapsing, piece by piece, because it had never been true, it had always been a construction, a fiction that my mother had maintained through sheer force of will and psychological manipulation, and once people started questioning it, it fell apart. My parents' lawyers moved for a summary judgment, claiming there was no case. The judge did not agree. The judge looked at the evidence and said that there was sufficient evidence of intentional infliction of emotional distress to proceed with the trial. That's when my father broke. He called me, not through his lawyer, directly, and for the first time in my life I heard something other than the careful performance of his personality. "I can't do this anymore," he said. He sounded old, tired. "I can't keep lying." "What are you talking about?" I said, though I had a feeling I knew. "Your mother," he said. She's not a good person, Leighton. I know I should have said something years ago. I know I should have stopped her. But I was afraid and I was weak and I let her hurt you. And I'm so sorry, I'm so incredibly sorry." And he told me the truth. The original incident. The reason my mother had spent 40 years convincing me I was crazy. The secret that had been important enough to destroy my life for. When I was 5 years old, I had gotten sick. My mother had given me medicine to help me sleep, but the medicine had been too strong. My mother had, possibly accidentally but probably intentionally, overdosed me, and I'd started to hallucinate, to become delirious with fever and medication, and in that state, I'd gone looking for my parents. I'd found my father in his study with a woman who was not my mother. The woman was someone I didn't recognize, but I understood, even in my medicated state, that something was wrong. My father was in the process of taking the woman's clothes off when I opened the door. It was an affair. My father had been having an affair, and I, in my fevered state, had discovered it. My mother had come upstairs after my father had yelled, had found me in the hallway, and had immediately gone into crisis management mode. She'd put me back to bed and told me it was a dream. But it wasn't a dream, and I had apparently mentioned it a few days later when the fever had broken. I'd asked my mother about the pretty lady I'd seen with Daddy. Instead of dealing with the affair, my mother had decided to discredit me. She'd decided that if I was the kind of person who made up stories, who had mental problems, who couldn't be trusted with the truth, then my story about the affair would never be believed. She'd spent 40 years poisoning everyone against me, so that if I ever, accidentally or deliberately, revealed what I'd seen, nobody would believe me. She destroyed me to cover up my father's infidelity. That's what Elena's mother had witnessed at the school. That's what the psychiatrists were being consulted about. That's why the letters in my mother's file said, if she remembers, everything falls apart. Not if she recovers, not if she gets better, if she remembers. She'd always known what I'd seen, and she'd spent decades making sure I'd never be able to tell anyone. When my father finished telling me this, I had to sit down. I was shaking with something between rage and relief. Relief that I finally knew. Relief that I wasn't crazy. Relief that there was an actual reason for the terror and manipulation, even if that reason was selfish and cruel. But the rage was something else. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because I can't look at myself in the mirror anymore," my father said. "Because your mother is trying to convince me to hire a better lawyer and take this to trial, and she's already talking about how she's going to destroy your credibility. She's planning to publicly claim that you have a history of mental illness. She's going to try to convince everyone that you're having a psychotic episode, and she's going to keep destroying you just like she destroyed you before, and I can't be part of that anymore." He was crying. My father was actually crying. "I'm going to testify," he said. "I'm going to tell the truth about what happened and why your mother did what she did. And I'm going to advocate for a settlement instead of a trial, because I don't think you deserve to have to go through the public humiliation of a trial. I think you deserve to have this over." The settlement came together very quickly after that. My parents agreed to pay me a substantial amount of money for the emotional distress and medical abuse they'd inflicted. They agreed to cover the costs of my therapy for the next 5 years. They agreed to make a formal acknowledgement of my emotional abuse in a sealed document, which meant that if they ever tried to claim I was unstable or mentally ill, there would be legal consequences. But the most important part was something Patricia insisted on. They agreed to sign a statement, also sealed, in which they both acknowledged that I had experienced abuse in the home, and that my mother had deliberately manipulated my perception of reality and convinced me I was unstable in order to discredit a memory I'd formed as a young child. It was an admission, it was documentation, it was proof that I had never been crazy. And the way I found out it was final was simple. My father called me and said, "It's over, we signed, you can breathe now." The trial never happened. The public humiliation my mother had been planning was averted, but there were still consequences. People found out. In a community like ours where everyone knows everyone, that kind of lawsuit doesn't stay secret. People knew that I'd sued my parents for emotional abuse. People knew that my parents had paid me to settle. People started to remember things. People started to question the narrative they'd been given. My mother's reputation, which she'd spent 40 years carefully building and protecting, crumbled. The community started to see her differently. The whisper campaigns she'd run about me rebounded on her. The concerned manner she'd adopted for so long started to look like calculated manipulation. My father, to his credit, didn't try to hide. He stopped going to church. He started going to therapy himself. He began the process of trying to understand why he'd allowed his wife to destroy his child. Whether it was guilt or genuine remorse, I don't know, but at least he wasn't pretending anymore. And me, I finally started to heal. Not immediately, not completely. Healing from decades of psychological abuse isn't something that happens all at once. It's not a moment of revelation where you suddenly feel better. It's a process, a slow reconstruction of yourself. There were days where I was still terrified of being crazy, days where I'd doubt myself and feel that old panic rising, days where I'd be confused about what was real and what was a false memory my parents had implanted. But there were also days where I could trust myself, days where I could look at my own thoughts and feelings and accept them without needing someone else to validate them. Days where I could exist without waiting for someone to tell me I was wrong about my own experience. Dr. Chen helped me understand something important. Psychological abuse creates these kinds of lasting impacts. It's not something you get over, it's something you integrate into your understanding of yourself and your history. "You were abused," she said to me one day, and it was the first time a mental health professional had ever said that without qualification or doubt. "You were deliberately manipulated by people who were supposed to care for you. You spent decades doubting yourself because of what they did to you. That's not something you're going to get over, but you can learn to trust yourself again." And slowly I did. I rebuilt friendships with people like Jessica, who were finally able to understand why our relationship had ended when we were teenagers. I started spending time with Elena, who was one of the bravest people I've ever met. I reconnected with my brother David, and we started to talk about what we'd both experienced in our childhoods. We weren't close yet, but we were trying. I got a promotion at work. I started dating again, and while I was terrified, at least now I understood where my terror was coming from. It wasn't coming from something being wrong with me. It was coming from the fact that I'd been trained not to trust myself. Learning to trust myself meant learning to be vulnerable again, and that was hard, but it was possible. 6 months after the settlement was finalized, Elena passed away. She'd been 85 and she'd been declining for a while, but it still felt sudden. I was devastated, because Elena had been the person who'd finally broken the spell. Elena had been the person who'd looked at me and said, "You are not crazy, you were never crazy." They were lying. At her funeral, I said something that I hadn't planned to say. I got up in front of everyone and I told them who Elena was. I told them about her mother, who'd witnessed psychological abuse at a school and carried that guilt for decades. I told them about Elena, who'd watched her neighbor destroy her daughter's mind and finally, when she was 84 years old, found the courage to speak. "Elena saved my life," I said, "not by fixing anything, not by making everything better, but by telling me the truth, by telling me that I wasn't crazy, by telling me that I could trust myself." And I cried at her funeral, but it was a different kind of crying than the crying I'd done on her porch. This was the crying of a person who'd been broken and was in the process of becoming whole again. After the funeral, Elena's niece came up to me with a box. "Elena wanted you to have this," she said. "She made me promise to give it to you if anything happened to her." Inside the box was a journal. Elena had kept a journal for 40 years, documenting the things she'd observed about my family. She'd documented every whisper campaign, every isolation event, every moment she'd watched me become smaller. She'd documented it all, and she'd left it to me. I read that journal and I wept, because there was another person's version of my life. Another person who could see clearly because she wasn't trapped inside the abuse like I was. Another person who confirmed over and over that I wasn't crazy, that I was a normal girl being abused by abnormal parents, that the problem was never me. That journal was one of the most healing things I've ever received, because it was proof in Alina's own words that this had happened, that I was right, that my memories were accurate. My parents eventually became the thing I think they always were underneath the performance, bitter, resentful people who blamed the world for not understanding them. My mother tried to tell people that I'd sued her out of spite, that I was having a mental health crisis, that the settlement was a result of my manipulation. Nobody believed her anymore, but she still tried. My father mostly stopped trying to defend himself or her. He just became smaller and quieter and disappeared in a way, figuratively, not literally. He's still alive, still living in the same house with my mother, but he's not really present anymore, not to me anyway. And I slowly became myself, the real myself, not the person my mother had convinced me to be, not the person who doubted everything she thought and felt, but a real person with real thoughts and real feelings and real memories. It took time, it took therapy, it took patience, it took grief because I had to mourn the childhood I never had and the life I might have lived if my parents had been different people. It took rage, and I had to learn how to sit with that rage without letting it consume me. It took vulnerability, and I had to learn how to be vulnerable without immediately second-guessing myself. But I did it. I'm still doing it if I'm being honest. Healing isn't linear. There are still days when I'm afraid that I'm not actually recovered, that I'm going to wake up and realize this was all a delusion, that I'm actually in a psychiatric ward and everything that's happened is a fantasy my broken mind created. But those days are becoming fewer and farther between. The settlement money is sitting in an account. I don't think I've spent much of it. It doesn't feel like mine. It feels like blood money. Payment for the decades they stole from me, but Patricia convinced me to keep it, to use it if I needed to. You earned it, she said. You earned it by having the courage to question yourself when you'd been trained never to. I did eventually spend some of it. I took a trip to Italy by myself. I did something I'd never done before. I traveled alone without being afraid that something terrible would happen to me, without waiting for someone to tell me I was being foolish or reckless or dramatic. I traveled alone because I wanted to, and I trusted myself to be okay. When I got back from Italy, I started writing this down, not for anyone else initially, just for me, just to document what had happened, to make sure that the truth was recorded somewhere, to make sure that if I ever started to doubt myself again, I could come back to this and remember, you were right. You were always right. But then I thought about Alina. I thought about how much it would have helped her if she'd had documentation from another person who'd been through the same thing. I thought about how many people are trapped in situations like mine, convinced that they're the problem when really the problem is the people they're supposed to trust. So I'm sharing this, not with my name necessarily, but with my story, with the hope that someone reading this will recognize themselves in it, will recognize the moment when they started to doubt themselves, will recognize the pattern of someone who says they care while systematically destroying their credibility, will recognize the slow, systematic isolation that happens when someone makes you believe you're the problem. And I want them to know you're not crazy. Whatever they've told you about yourself, it's probably a lie designed to protect them. You're not unstable, you're not difficult, you're not the problem. You are a person who is surviving something terrible, and the fact that you're surviving it is a testament to your strength, not your weakness. And there's an Alina out there for you somewhere, someone who's been watching, someone who sees the truth, someone who will eventually have the courage to tell you. Hold on until they do. Because the other side of this, the side where you finally understand that you were right all along, that your memories are real, that you can trust yourself, that side is worth it. The other side of this is freedom. And I'm finally free. Years later, I'm 41 now. I have a life that looks nothing like the life I would have had if I'd never questioned my parents. I have relationships with people who believe me. I have a job that I'm good at. I have an apartment that's mine, decorated with things that I chose, filled with memories that are true. I have a therapist who I see regularly, not because I'm broken, but because trauma has lasting impacts and it's good to have professional support while I work through them. I have a journal like Alina had. I document my thoughts and my memories, not because I'm afraid they're wrong but because they matter. because I matter, because my perspective is valid and real and important. And I have the understanding that the people who hurt me the most were people who were supposed to love me. That's a painful understanding, but it's also liberating, because once you know that the people who hurt you are the ones you thought you could trust, you can start to rebuild your trust with different criteria. You can learn to see the signs of manipulation. You can learn to walk away from people who try to make you doubt yourself. I won't ever get back the years my parents stole from me. I won't ever know who I would have been without their abuse, but I'm learning to be okay with that. I'm learning to exist in the present as the person I am now, instead of constantly grieving the person I might have been. My parents still exist in the world. My mother still tells people that I'm troubled. My father still says nothing. They're living with the consequences of their actions, but I'm not sure they've truly understood what they did or what they cost me. But that's okay. I don't need them to understand. I don't need their acknowledgement or their apology or their acceptance. I needed to understand myself, and I do now. I was never the problem. I was never unstable. I was never crazy. I was just a girl who trusted the wrong people, and then I learned to trust myself. And that made all the difference.